so not far-right thugs then, and that most of the protesters were local. So it wasn't a coordinated cross-country effort. Report today by the police inspectorate. It found, and I quote, "No conclusive evidence that the summer riots that were triggered by the Southport murders were coordinated by extremist groups. Were local and I'm quoting again, the violence was mainly unrelated to their ideology or political views."
Everything you've been told about the Southport protests was a lie. The media and politicians painted them as far-right extremism, but a newly released police report tells a completely different story. The truth? These were local residents, mothers, fathers and neighbours, responding to the brutal murders of 3 young girls. No extremist groups, no coordinated action, just real people expressing genuine grief and anger at a system that failed them.
For no reason whatsoever. They were protesting against the migrant crisis, Keir. Anyway, as confirmed by this report, so not far-right thugs then. And it goes on to say, what were the reasons for these protests? So it does say they were protests. Keir Starmer, they're not protests. Or were they then just a sort of spontaneous eruption of violence?
Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favour. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great! Thank you so much. Now back to the video.
But who are the anti-immigration protesters taking part in riots across the country?
It might be, for example, what we saw in Southport. People travelled into Southport.
They've attacked people, property and the police, and are responsible for some of the most serious and sustained public violence the UK has seen in a decade.
People from these extremist groups, whoever it was, these people were, almost sort of their duty to go up and stand for their nation, in inverted commas.
The official story was too neat, too convenient. Within hours of the Southport killings, government officials and media outlets labelled the subsequent protests as far-right extremism. A coordinated campaign by dangerous elements, they said. But what if that narrative was manufactured to protect those in power? When 3 young girls were brutally murdered at a Taylor Swift dance class, the nation was understandably horrified. The suspect, Axel Rudakuba, was quickly identified. But rather than focusing on how this tragedy happened, the establishment pivoted to a different target, the grieving community itself.
And kind of take to the streets of Southport and riot. So I think what we are seeing is people from the outside coming in, but then also locals, kind of protesting and rioting in quite violent and reprehensible ways.
The reality on the ground told a different story. These weren't organised extremists bussed in from across the country. They were mothers who dropped their children at similar dance classes. Fathers who recognised their worst nightmares in those deaths, neighbours who questioned how such violence could erupt in their community. Their anger wasn't manufactured. It was raw, genuine, and directed at a system they believed had failed them. Axel Rudakuba's presence in the UK raises uncomfortable questions about immigration enforcement. He'd been in the country for years, reportedly with mental health issues that went unaddressed. The system that should have identified problems didn't work. The safety nets designed to protect communities failed. These aren't far-right talking points. They're legitimate concerns about government competence. Keir Starmer's government faced a critical choice: acknowledge these systemic failures or redirect public attention. They chose the latter. By framing the protests as extremism rather than genuine community response, they shifted accountability away from their policies. The focus moved from the murders to the protests themselves, a convenient distraction from harder questions about why 3 children were dead. But now we have the police inspectorate report, and it contradicts almost everything we were told. The document, released with minimal fanfare, confirms what many suspected. There was no coordinated extremist action behind these protests. The initial gatherings were spontaneous community responses. Local residents, not outside agitators, comprised the majority of participants. The report states that initial intelligence assessments overestimated the involvement of known far-right elements. It acknowledges that most participants were local residents with no previous involvement in extremist activities. These aren't minor corrections. They completely undermine the narrative pushed by politicians and amplified by media outlets. Specific evidence in the report is damning. CCTV footage shows that the first protesters arrived individually or in small family groups, not in organised formations. Communication analysis found no evidence of coordinated planning on far-right networks before the initial gatherings. Local officers reported knowing many protesters as residents with no extremist connections. Why would politicians misrepresent local residents as extremists? The uncomfortable answer lies in accountability. By casting protesters as far-right agitators, the government positioned itself as a defender against extremism rather than the target of legitimate criticism. It's much easier to condemn far-right thugs than to address grieving parents asking why their children aren't safe. The police report confirms these protests were genuine expressions of community grief and anger at government failures. This wasn't about politics, it was about parents terrified that what happened to those 3 girls could happen to their own children. It was about citizens questioning why warning signs were missed. It was about a community demanding better from those responsible for public safety. The human cost of this misrepresentation extends beyond the protests themselves. Consider Peter Lynch, a 42-year-old father of 2 who attended one of the early gatherings. With no previous criminal record or political affiliations, he expressed his frustration about immigration enforcement. His image appeared in a newspaper the next day, labelled as a far-right protester. He lost his job. His children were bullied at school. His family received threats. All because he dared to question whether the system was working. Lynch isn't alone. Dozens of ordinary citizens found themselves branded as extremists simply for asking uncomfortable questions. The message was clear: challenge the official narrative, and you'll be labelled a dangerous element in society. This isn't accountability, it's intimidation. The most disturbing aspect of this story isn't just the initial misrepresentation, it's how long the false narrative persisted, even after evidence emerged contradicting it. Weeks after the police report was filed internally, politicians continued referring to the protests as organised far-right violence. Media outlets continued publishing headlines about extremist networks, despite having access to information suggesting otherwise. What happened in Southport represents a profound breach of trust. When citizens cannot express genuine grief and anger without being branded as extremists, democracy itself is threatened. When those in power manipulate public perception to avoid accountability, they betray their fundamental responsibility to those they serve. And now, while politicians have moved on to other topics, Peter Lynch and others like him still live with the consequences of being falsely labelled. Their story deserves to be told. The Southport tragedy exposes a serious pattern in British politics. When faced with their own failures, our political class instinctively controls the narrative rather than solves the problem. They label concerned citizens as extremists to delegitimise valid criticism. Peter Lynch's case shows how devastating these false labels can be for ordinary people who simply question authority. This strategy of silencing dissent through accusations of extremism isn't accidental. It's calculated. It protects those in power from accountability while punishing those who speak up. Until we demand genuine answers instead of accepted narratives, this cycle continues. Do you think the government prioritises its image over your safety? Share your thoughts below.